Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to the 34th Annual Lorette LaPrevo Writers Symposium. My name is Katie Hoover. I'm the coordinator of oral and written communication at Caldwell Community College. And we are just so pleased to have you join us for this evening's event. The Writers Symposium Committee, I did not do this all by myself. The Writers Symposium Committee would definitely like to thank all of our colleagues and campus partners. This includes our campus bookstore, our Learning Resource Center, student activities, our art department. All of the art here is student work. And of course, Dario for the ice cream. Woo woo. So this event and many other events like this is made possible by the CCC&TI Foundation. So we want to thank the foundation for their continued support of our programs. Before we introduce our speaker, I would like to share a poem our students wrote yesterday in preparation for this event. This is inspired by tonight's theme and the poem Where I'm From by George Ella Lyon. And I put it with the other stack. Okay, one moment, please. I'm very sorry. Making people run. So, sorry about that. So, I am from a college where students come first, where learning is fun and people are kind. I'm from open mic in the student lounge and Let's Go Cobras screamed from the stands. I'm from a college where rooms are full and you can always meet someone new. I'm from Village Inn Pizza on Wednesdays and cars zooming down Highway 321. I'm from sunsets over High Brighton Mountain, from flowing rivers and not enough snow, from riding bikes on the Greenway, from trucker hats and Walmart, cows and bows, squatted trucks, and a Dollar General on every corner. Here is a place for birds and minds to soar. Here you have value. I am from Cobra Nation. So I am going to turn it over, thank you, to the students who wrote that. That was by our students. And I'm going to turn it over to Liz, Liz Silvers, our VP of Instruction, who's going to introduce our author.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Katie. What a great introduction. Well, I have the distinct pleasure in introducing Mr. Ron Rash to tonight's event. We're fortunate to have him returning to our campus after two well-received visits in 2006 and 2010. With tonight's event, you have earned three-peat status, so that means you are forever part of Caldwell and the Caldwell Way. Mr. Rash has been busy writing since his last visit to CCC&TI and will discuss writing in and about the North Carolina mountains. Drawing inspiration from life in the Appalachian Mountains, both in the past and the present, Rash has authored multiple prize-winning and best-selling novels, including Serena, Above the Waterfall, The Cove, One Foot in Eden, which I feel like is our Appalachian Mountains, Saints at the River, and The World Made Straight. Mr. Rash is a New York Times best-selling author of short fiction, poetry, and many award-winning novels. Hailed by the New York Times as one of the great American authors of At Work today, his accolades include numerous awards, as well as being named the PEN/Faulkner finalist for Serena and Chemistry and Other Stories. His short story collection, Burning Bright, won the 2010 Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award and was selected for the National Endowment of the Arts NEA Big Read Library. He has also received the O. Henry Prize on 2 occasions. The Savannah Morning News has written that in every Rash book, the reader is treated to countless moments of stunning illumination on the human condition. Mr. Rash has deep roots in western North Carolina. Raised by Buncombe and Watauga County natives, Mr. Rash grew up in Bowling Springs, North Carolina, and his family has lived in the southern Appalachian, not Appalachian, mountains since the mid-1700s. Mr. Rash is a professor of Appalachian Culture Studies at Western Carolina University. This evening, Mr. Rash's presentation is titled Mountains and Memory, a reading by Ron Rash. So, sit back, relax, and prepare yourselves to hear a storyteller of the highest rank. Without further ado, welcome.
I appreciate that kind introduction, and I appreciate even more the accents. I was in France a couple of years ago, and I was invited to a secondary school, high school, and once I got there, one of the teachers explained that she wanted her students to hear an American speak English. And I had to explain to her that except for 6 states, I spoke a foreign language in the United States. And I just had this image of these kids going to New York City sounding like me. But anyway, it is good to be here. I taught 17 years at a community college. I truly believe in that mission. And I continue to hear from some of my students. It's kind of interesting if you teach at a community college, you find out they're the ones, after a while, a lot of them, you might find them drawing your blood or giving you shots or, at the dentist's office. And I always hope they did. I always ask them, how'd you do in my class before I let them go much farther. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read about an 8-page short story. Then I'm going to read maybe 4 or 5-page piece. And a couple of poems, and then I know that some of the students and maybe some of the people in the community have been reading my work, so I would like to talk. But I thought I'd read my last book, a story I'd heard a lot about, and that actually took place in this region. In 1916, there was a flood, the Great Flood in western North Carolina. At Grandfather Mountain, and the Weather Bureau actually, registered rainfall amounts even then. I did some research on this. It rained 22 inches in 24 hours. The Catawba River was 47 feet over flood stage. 80 people died. There's this amazing anecdote of watching, actually around Hickory, boxcars going down the river, just floating down the river in this huge. And so I'd always sensed I was probably going to write a story about that, but it coalesced into a story about the Civil War. My mother's family is from the Ajo community near between Boone and Blowing Rock. My father's family's from a rural community in Buncombe County, and during the Civil War, I have 2 photographs of my relatives, and they're both wearing Union uniforms, which it was kind of interesting because sometimes we don't realize how many Union soldiers came from this region. But this story concerns a soldier. It's 1916. He survived the Civil War, and his luck was that he wore a belt, and the belt buckle for the Union would have an eagle on it, and it would be brass. And his luck was that it saved him one time, and he hopes it will save him again. So this is taking place when the flood hits in 1916. It's called The Belt. The rain announced itself timidly, a few soft taps on the tin roof. Soon the rain fell steadily. Since it was July, Jubal waited for rumbles of thunder, the dark sky darkening more as lightning stabbed the ridges. Then rain would gallop down, pounding the tin before the sun herded the storm into Tennessee. But this was more like November rain, the kind that lingered days. Night came and the rain continued. As Jubal settled into the shuck mattress to sleep, it hit the roof not like hooves, but a drummer boy's quick step. When he awoke the next morning, the sound overhead was the same martial cadence. So he's not surprised that he dreamed again of the war, of the moments after his horse buckled and he'd been thrown. As Jubal rose from the bed, the aches of 8 decades awakened too. His bones always hurt more in wet weather, so before dressing, he rubbed liniment on his back and shoulders. He looked out the window at the rain, the rivulets coursing down the ridge. As he pressed the brass buckle into the belt holes, he felt the familiar indention the mini ball had made. Jubal went into the kitchen, unhinged the range's iron door, struck a match to the wood and newspaper he tendered the night before. He set the coffee pot on the iron eye. The house was chilly, so for the first time in 2 months, he made a hearth fire, stood in front with his hands out while the coffee pot heated, filled his cup, stepped onto the front porch, and stared across the pasture at the French Broad River. Water usually clear enough to see the river's bottom was now brown as his coffee. The sandbars had disappeared, but the big boulder midstream broke the onrushing water like a ship's hull. No flood had ever submerged this rock. When Jubal saw the buggy coming up the muddy lane, he remembered it was Saturday. Rob, his grandson, was bringing the boy to stay with him while Rob and his wife Lizzie went to Marshall. Rob pulled up beside the porch and Lizzie and the child got out. Lizzie holding an umbrella over their heads as they came up the steps. Rob pulled the brake, brought the canvas tote sack onto the porch. Clear most all week and now it comes a-pouring, Lizzie said, shaking her head. It's surely over the banks down in the bottomland, Rob said, as the three of them stared at the river. There's likely crops being washed away. You sure you ought to go, Jubal asked. I checked and the bridge is fine, Rob said. For now, Jubal cautioned. But if it don't clear by afternoon, it may not be. Eggs and butter won't keep till next market day, Lizzie said. And you know we got need of cash money. I know that, Jubal said. I just want you all to be careful. If that bridge looks chancy on the way back, Rob said, we'll stay with Lizzie's folks. If it comes to that, would you mind keeping the boy till morning, Lizzie asked. Of course not, Jubal said, taking the child into his arms and nuzzling with his beard. Me and him will be fine, won't we, partner? The child giggled, clung tighter around Jubal's neck. We best get on, Lizzie said, bussing the boy on the cheek. You be sweet and maybe we'll bring you back a play pretty. Rub that lucky belt buckle of yours, Rob said as he released the brake. Maybe it'll settle this weather down. Rob jerked the reins and the wagon went down the pike toward the bridge. Jubal shifted the child to one arm. Let's get you out of nasty weather, he said, giving a last look at the river. The boulder was still visible, but less of it showed. Once inside, Jubal set the boy and the sack on the davenport. He went to the back porch and brought the box filled with the whirligigs and animals he'd carved for the child. He set the toys between the davenport and the hearth. There you are, Jubal, he told his namesake, and seated the boy on the floor. He poured himself another cup of coffee and watched the child play. A lucky man, he'd often said of himself, and worn the source of that luck every day since the afternoon it had saved his life. He'd never meant it as a provocation, but in the first years after the war, the buckles etched eagles, wings and talons extended, had caused hard stares, at times words, and once a fist fight. Now only a handful of veterans remained. There was another war, bigger than any before, and despite what President Wilson said, the country was edging into it. Jubal feared that Rob, his only grandson, might be called up. He almost expected it. Lucky as Jubal had been, little good fortune had found its way to those around him. Pure luck, his comrades called it after they'd marveled at the buckle and its indention. After Chickamauga, some touched the buckle before battle, but it seemed the luck was indeed pure, unable to be diluted and spread to others, then or afterward. Jubal's wife and son and daughter were all shadowed by gravestones now. Rob, his only grandchild, had found little luck in his life. He'd married well, but he and Lizzie had encountered a passel of troubles. Their barn had burned 3 Octobers ago, a year's worth of curing tobacco lost. But before that, 2 miscarriages had sent Lizzie into a dark place. But luck had come with this child playing before him. Despite his being born a month too soon, the boy had not only survived, but quickly grew hale and hearty. Jubal had never asked, but he'd always wondered if Rob and Lizzie thought naming the child after him would help the boy survive. The Franklin clock chimed, another hour passing with no sign of the rain easing. He went to the window, but the glass was too streaked to see much. The child got up, gained his balance, toddled over to Jubal, raised his arms to be lifted. "Getting hungry, are you?" Jubal said, picking up the boy. He felt the hipping. It was dry, so he set the child down and opened the sack. He got out the nursing bottle, put on his coat and hat, and went out the back door to the spring house. By the time he got back, the hat and coat were soaked. The child suckled the rubber tip until nothing was left, then put his head on Jubal's chest and closed his eyes. Jubal walked to the back room and laid the boy on the bed. He poured another cup of coffee and went to the front porch. The boulder was only a foot or so above the water. The pike in the lower pasture had vanished except for the barbed wire fence. He thought of Rob and Lizzie and hoped they had the good sense to stay in Marshall. Even if the bridge held, the pike could be washed out. Jubal realized he had not eaten, so went to the larder and got the cornbread. To crumble it into a glass of buttermilk would be all the better, but the hat and coat he'd set by the hearth weren't ready for another trip to the spring house. He slathered the bread with blackberry jam and ate it before swallowing the last of the coffee. Jubal checked on the child and went out to the porch. The boulder was gone. Where it had been, the water appeared smooth, almost calm, that illusion holding until driftwood and trees swept past. Then a chicken coop and a flatboat that slowly twirled as if searching for the river it had once known. The fence was gone now, and so was most of the pasture. The cow and its calf huddled in the upper corner. More things once alive sped by. Chickens and dogs, livestock, then a body. It swept past so quickly Jubal could do nothing but stare. Holding an old field jacket over his head, he crossed the soaked ground. He opened the latch gate and herded the cow and calf out. Back on the porch, Jubal saw what was more important than the one body. A barn lay on its side, drifting down the valley like an overturned ark. He had built this house himself. Jubal knew it was solid, but what held it to the earth were flat creek rocks and 4 locust beams. No one lived close by except Rob and Lizzie, and their house was closer to the river than this one, so the only shelter was here. He went to the back room and sat beside the child. "You've been lucky once," Jubal told the boy softly. As if evoking a talisman for the both of them, Jacob thought again of Chickamauga. That moment in the cavalry skirmish when the horse buckled and hurled him to the ground. He had rolled onto his back just as the enemy cavalryman slowed his mount and leaned against Jubal, the pistol's muzzle only feet away. Jubal did not hear the shot, but saw the flash and then smoke from the charge. The man rode on as Jubal waited for the pain and what would surely relieve it. He placed an open palm beneath his shirt, slid it slowly down his stomach, then under the belt and trousers. No blood or torn flesh. Some sort of misfire, he concluded, rising to his feet. The battle had moved on, leaving dead men and horses scattered around him. Only then had Jubal looked for a tear in his jacket, saw instead the indention where the minie ball had struck the brass buckle. Jubal listened for a few more moments and noticed a change in the rain's cadence. He placed a hand on the boy's hair and stroked it. The child shifted a bit, but his eyes did not open. Jubal stepped out on the porch and found the rain was indeed slackening. To the east, the sky had begun paling, but too late. The pasture was now under the river. Jubal watched a rattlesnake attempt to swim across the current, failed to make the porch steps only yards away. A hog pen swept by, the hog itself roiling behind it. It's got to crest soon, he told himself, but the water had reached the first step and begun seeping into the house. Crying came from the back room, so Jubal went inside and lifted the child into his arms, felt the hipping. Best keep it that way, boy, Jubal told the child. It might be the onlyest thing dry on you soon. They went to the front porch. The rain had almost stopped, but water continued thickening around the steps. Soon it would be all the way under the house. Jubal went back inside and changed his shoes for boots. He got the child out of his gown and into his rompers, wrapped him in the blanket, and went to the back porch. There was nowhere to go except up the ridge. But after he gained a few yards of ground, Jubal slipped, turning onto his side to protect the child. He slid almost to the back steps before stopping. For a moment he lay there, breathing hard as the child squalled in his arms. Something had twisted or torn in his knee, so first he kneeled, then slowly got to his feet. The brown flood water reached all the way to the ridge now, and Jubal knew they wouldn't survive another slide, so he sloshed through the water to where mountain laurel grew. He did not try to stand, but got on his knees, holding the child in one arm as he worked his way upward. One plant pulled free of the earth, but he caught hold of another before they started to slide. When there was no more laurel, he stopped. Jubal's heart banged so hard against his chest, the ribs felt like a rickety fence about to shatter. If it's lasted 81 years, it can last a few more minutes, he told himself, and tried to figure out what to do next. He patted the child through the blanket. A few yards above them was a stand of tulip poplars. Though the branches were too high to grasp, a trunk to grab hold of might be enough to keep them alive. Jubal did not look back because he did not need to. He could hear the water rising behind them. The child was silent now, as if it too listened. Then came a loud rending as the house pulled free of its moorings. Jubal's heart continued to hammer and his knee burned. Between the poplars and the laurel was a scrub oak. He stabbed his free hand deep into the soggy ground and pulled closer. Only then did he see what coiled around it. The snake wasn't as large as the one he'd watched earlier from the front porch, but it had the same triangular head and blunt tail. I just want to share it with you a minute, Jubal said softly. Then me and this chap will be on our way. Jubal slowly grasped the sapling inches above the snake. But as he pulled himself closer, his hand slipped downward, pressed the snake's cold scales. His muscles tensed and then contracted tighter around the trunk. The rattle buzzed twice, ceased. Neither of them moved until Jubal felt the water rising onto his boots. "Get on now," he told the snake, pressed his hand slowly but firmly on its body. The snake gave a brief rattle, then unspooled and slithered down into the water. Jubal pulled himself even with the scrub oak. He was so tired, so old. The river whispered for him to surrender. "Everything else has," the water said. Jubal pushed ahead and reached his free arm around the closest poplar. He looked up at the branches, the nearest 30 feet above him. Even if he could have gone on, there was nothing farther up the ridge to hold on to. Beyond the branches was only a too-late clearing sky. He looked back. All he could see was water. Jubal touched the belt buckle. "Be lucky one more time," he told it. They found him the next morning. The sun was out. Something flashed from within a stand of poplars. Some kind of signal, the two men in the flatboat thought, lifted their oars and made their way across the drowned farm. At first, they thought it was an apparition caused by fatigue, because the child seemed to be hovering above the water. Then they saw the belt around the tree trunk, heard a soft whimpering, and they marveled at a child held aloft and alive in the grasp of an eagle. I actually did hear a story about a soldier during the Civil War. I'm sure more than one that's happened during wartime that the bullet did hit the belt buckle. But I just met a poet, Alan, and actually two poets, I think, or two people interested in poetry at least. And so I'm going to read two quick poems. The title of this is kind of honoring the family and the place and our place in it. And so I thought I'd do a poem from my mother's family from the Ajo community in Watauga County and environs around there. And have you ever noticed how famous people have more cousins? Well, my family claims Doc Watson. Now, it's a little convoluted, but it's there. My mother, a few years ago, I think it was about 4 years ago, one of our relatives had died up in Watauga County. And at the funeral, and this was one of the last times he played, Doc Watson played and sang, "When the Lion Will Lie Down with the Lamb." And I thought, boy, who better to send you out than Doc Watson? His son, Merle, was a very talented musician, and he died in a tractor accident. The tractor overturned, and so this is a poem about an elegy for Merle Watson. Nothing's on the level in this terrain. A tractor loses its balance quick as a heart. One tractor wheel turns in the morning light. One hand clutches the earth, trying to hold on. Wayfaring stranger, deep river blues, those fatalistic mountain hymns become you. Tonight your father cradles his guitar. A stage half empty confirms what we don't hear, what does not echo. Feel the runs and lines. Musician, distant kin, your silence survives. And from the other side of the family, this is there's a graveyard in Buncombe County in Leicester or Leicester. There's an argument about which one is right. And Rash is not that common a name, but Buncombe County, some in Wilkes County, and there's a graveyard where my grandparents are buried there, and this is a Good Friday poem. And if you know John Donne's poem about Good Friday, I'm kind of playing off that. But just that sense of thinking about them being there and imagining a resurrection. Good Friday, 1995, driving westward. This day I feel I live among strangers. The old blood ties beckon, so I drive west to Buncombe County, a weedy graveyard where my rare last name crumbles on stone. All were hard-shell Baptists, farmers who believe the soul is another seed that endures when flesh and blood are shed, that all things planted rise toward the sun. I dream them shaking dirt off strange new forms. Gathered for the last harvest, they hold hands, take their first day's steps toward heaven. Well, people sometimes accuse me of being a very dark writer. My brother enjoys tormenting me with reviewers who say that Ron Rash is implacably grim. Things start off bad and they only get worse. I don't know. I think sometimes people expect me to have a raven on my shoulder or something. But when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a musician. A rock and roll star or a bluegrass star, something. And I had just two small problems. I couldn't sing and I couldn't play an instrument. And I kept trying to play an instrument and I just couldn't do it. I just had no facility. So, one day I was thinking about, I'm going to make somebody who did have that talent so miserable that I'll be glad I went in another direction. And I thought, what would it be like to, be somebody playing a kind of honky tonk, and what would be kind of the thing that would make you crazy? And it would be having to play Freebird every hour. It's called Waiting for the End of the World. And I'll finish with this. So it's somewhere between Saturday night and Sunday morning clockwise, and I'm in a cinder block roadhouse called The Last Chance, and I'm playing Freebird for the 5th time tonight. But I'm not thinking of Ronnie Van Zant, but an artist dredged up from my former life, Willie Yates, and his line, "Surely some revelation is at hand." But the only rough beast slouching toward me is my rhythm guitar player, Tim Peeler, who is down on all fours, weaving through the crowd of tables between the bathroom and stage. One of the great sins of the 60s was introducing drugs to the good old boy element of Southern society. If you were some Harvard psychology professor like Timothy Leary, drugs might well expand your consciousness. But they work just the opposite way for people like Tim, shriveling the brain to a reptilian level of aggression and paranoia. There's no telling what Tim has snorted or swallowed in the bathroom, but his pupils have expanded to the size of dimes. He passes a table and sees a bare leg, a female leg, and grabs hold. He takes off an attached high heel and starts licking the foot. It takes about 3 seconds for a bigger foot with a steel-capped toe to swing into the back of Tim's head like a football player kicking an extra point. Tim curls up in a fetal position and blacks out among the peanut shells and cigarette butts. So now it's just my bass player, David Dixon, Hal Deaton, my drummer, and me. I finished Freebird, so that means the next songs are my choice. They got to have Freebird at least once an hour, Rodney said when he hired me, saying it like his clientele were diabetics needing insulin. The rest of the time, you play what you want, he'd added. And I'm going to skip a little bit of this. And let's see. Yeah. Beyond the tables of human wreckage, I see Hubert McLean sitting at the bar, beer in one hand, Louisville Slugger in the other. Hubert is our bouncer, 250 pounds of atavistic Celtic violence, coiled and ready to happen. On the front of the ball cap, covering his survivalist buzz cut, a leering skeleton waves a sickle in one hand and a black and white checkered victory flag in the other. The symbolism is unclear. On the opposite side of the bar, Rodney's taking whatever people hand him, crumpled bills, handfuls of nickels and dimes, payroll checks, wedding rings, wristwatches. One time a guy offered a gold filling he dug out of his mouth with a pocket knife. Rodney didn't even blink. Watching him operate, it's easy to believe Rodney's simply an updated version of Flem Snopes, the kind of guy whose first successful business venture is showing photos of his naked sister to his junior high peers. But that's not the case at all. Rodney graduated from the University of North Carolina with a degree in social work. He wanted to make the world better, but according to Rodney, the world wasn't interested. His career as a social worker ended the same week it began. Rodney had borrowed a church bus to take some of Columbia's disadvantaged youth to a Braves game. Halfway to Atlanta, the teenagers mutinied. They beat Rodney with a tire iron, took his money and clothes, and left him naked and bleeding in a ditch. A week later, the same day Rodney got out of the hospital, the bus was found half submerged in the Okefenokee swamp. It took another month to round up the youths, several of whom had procured entry-level positions in a Miami drug cartel. Rodney says running the Last Chance is a philosophical statement. Above the cash register, he's plastered one of those Darwinian bumper stickers with the fish outline and 4 revolving legs. Rodney's drawn a speech bubble in front of the fish's mouth. Exterminate the brutes, the fish says. Advice Rodney seems to have taken to heart. There's only one mixed drink at the Last Chance, what Rodney calls the Terminator. It's 6 ounces of Jack Daniels and 6 ounces of Surrey County moonshine and 6 ounces of Sam's Choice tomato juice. Some customers claim a dash of lighter fluid is added for good measure. No one, not even Hubert, has ever drunk more than 3 of these and remained standing. It usually takes only 2 to put the drinkers onto the floor, tomato juice dribbling down their chins like they've just been shot in the mouth. Anyway, we move on to the end. Rodney lifts a bullhorn from under the bar and announces it's 1:45 and anybody who wants a last drink had better get it now. There are few takers, most customers now lacking money or consciousness. I'm thinking to finish up with Steve Earle's Graveyard Shift and Dwight Yoakam's 1,000 Miles from Nowhere. But the drunk who's been using a pool of vomit for a pillow the last hour lifts his head. He fumbles a lighter out of his pocket and flicks it on. Free bird, he grunts. Lays his head back in the vomit. And I'm thinking, why not? Ronnie Van Zant didn't have the talent of Steve Earle or Gary Stewart or Dwight Yoakam, but he did the best with what he had. Skinner never pruned their southern musical roots to give them national appeal, and that gave their music, whatever its failings, an honesty and an edge. So I take out the slide from my jean pocket, start that long, wailing solo for probably the millionth time in my life. I'm on automatic pilot, let my fingers take care of business while my mind roams elsewhere. Heads rise from tables and stare my way. Conversations stop. And this is the way it always is, as though Van Zant somehow found a conduit into the collective unconscious of his race. Whatever it is, they become serious and reflective. Maybe it's just the music's slow, surging build. Or maybe something more. A yearning for the kind of freedom Van Zant's lyrics deal with. A recognition of the human need to lay their burden down. Maybe, for a few moments, being connected to the music and lyrics enough to actually feel unshackled, free, and in flight. As I finish Freebird, Rodney cuts on every light in the building, including some high-beam John Deere tractor lights he's rigged up on the ceiling. It's like the last scene in a vampire movie. People start wailing and whimpering. They cover their eyes, crawl under tables, and ultimately, and this is the goal, scurry toward the door and out the dark, dragging the passed out and knocked out with them. I'm off the clock now, but I don't take off my guitar and unplug the amp. Instead, I play the opening chords of Elvis Costello's Waiting for the End of the World. Costello's tried to be the second coming of Perry Como of late, but his first two albums were pure rage and heartbreak. Hal is draped over his drum set, passed out. David's headed out the door with a big woman in a purple jumpsuit. Tim's still on the floor, so I'm flying solo. I can't remember all the lyrics, so except for the refrain, it's like I'm speaking in tongues. But it's 2 a.m. in Western Carolina, and not much of anything makes sense. All you can do is pick up your guitar and play, which is what I'm doing. I'm laying down some mean guitar licks. And though I'm not much of a singer, I'm giving it all I got. And although the last chance is almost completely empty now, that's okay as well, because I'm merging the primal and existential. And I've cranked up the volume so loud, empty beer bottles are vibrating off tables, and the tractor beams are pulsing like strobe lights, and whatever rough beast is asleep out there in the dark's getting its wake-up call, and I'm ready and waiting for whatever it's got. Well, you've all been there, right? I can tell. Oh, my. I used to go to a bar called The Last Chance. It deserved its name, believe me. I think we got a little time for questions. They asked me to leave a little bit, so I'm glad to try to answer a few.
What inspired you to write the short story about the ascent?
The ascent, yeah, that's a story about a boy, young boy, who finds a plane, a Cessna plane, and actually that's interesting because where I teach near Western Carolina, where I teach in one of the national forests. This was about 20 years ago. A plane actually crashed a Cessna, and they didn't find it till 6 years later. And it was a bear hunter who found it in reality. And I knew there was a story there. And I cut out the clipping and I left it on bureau where I'd see it almost every day for about 3 or 4 years. And I kept thinking, well, I'd write the story from the bear hunter's point of view. I thought that would be interesting. And then I thought, well, maybe it could be somebody else. But one day I just realized, well, what if it were a child? And then at the same moment, and what if the child looked in that plane and wasn't frightened? And what would that say about the life that and his parents and the life he was living? So that was a lot of it. His
was so unexpected.
Well, I hope so. I mean, in the right way for a story to end. But that was a story. Actually, gosh, that was written about year 2000. It was right when we started seeing the opioid and the meth stuff start to crank up. And it's interesting because I read that story in Denver, Colorado, and somebody said, well, why are you making this up? It's not, people are not getting addicted to opioids in North Carolina. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Do you prefer to write novels or short stories?
Well, no, I think short stories are my favorite form, and that's what I enjoy the most. Novels are just torturous. I just finished one. It took 5.5 years. It'll be out in September. And every time I write one, I just go around swearing I'll never write another one. And I think I mean it this time. I really, because it. But there's this great. I mean, there's a difference. I think the really nice thing about a novel particularly is that you have a sense of creating a whole world. In a story, it's more like you kind of take the reader through a kind of brief passage. They both have their pleasures, but novels, somebody was asking me about novels, and I said, there's nothing glamorous about it. It's like being a mule. It really is. You just go up and down these rows, sentences, and you just, you don't want to look up, you want blinders, you don't even want to think about how much work this is going to be, because I tend to do like 20 drafts on my novels. I mean, tough, and the last couple of drafts, it's all about sound, syllables, stresses, yeah.
The Night the New Jesus Fell, that one to me, it's so descriptive, you could almost see it playing out like a TV movie.
Yeah.
Have you ever been approached about doing something like that?
No, there have been a couple of movies made of my novels, one bad, one good. But yeah, I mean, I haven't, but that, those stories were fun to write. That actually, somebody asked me that. My first book was all comic stories. And somebody asked me, well, what happened? How come you quit? I said, I had children. and I mean, in a way, I wasn't being completely facetious. It really kind of shifts the way you see the world. And I think you're more aware of the world they're going into. Yeah.
Is there a story bouncing around back there that you have been wanting to write, you've been meaning to write, but you just haven't gotten to yet?
Oh, yeah. It's interesting. I keep notebooks and sometimes clippings, as I said, of some things. Yeah, there are a couple of things. I've actually, I probably shouldn't do this, but I'm fascinated with a story where somebody sees something on a game trail camera on their property, and it's not just a poacher, it's something else. And so you can't steal that. I'm sure somebody's done it, but yeah. But yesterday I was thinking I kind of wanted to write. I thought I haven't written anything kind of funny in a while. I thought I'm gonna write. I thought I'd write a story about this guy who his marriage loses his wife because his mother-in-law makes him watch Forrest Gump, and he hates that movie, and he starts making snide asides, and everything goes south. And I thought, I was amused, so whether nobody else was, I thought that'd be kind of fun. So I may try to write that next. Yeah.
What is your writing routine?
Well, I'm starting to slow down, but when from probably the age 25 till the last couple of years, I pretty much went at it hard as I could. I usually wrote, in the last 25 years, I pretty much was writing 6-8 hours a day.
You know your ending before you start writing?
Never. But I like to write in the mornings. And I think one of the most important things I've learned, now, I know friends who are novelists who they don't have schedules at all. It just works for different people. But what I found is that if I can make it a part of my day, so I'm very ritualistic. I sharpen a certain number of pencils. I get my huge glass of tea. And it's interesting because I've got, a number of my friends who are writers who smoke, and I get that it's almost like you want something tactile. And so, I have the tea. But I like to set it up, and I try to get it to where I'm in the same place writing. But I've learned to where I've traveled so much lately that, the last few years, I've learned to write in hotel rooms. And, but for me, it's important to do it every day. It just... if it becomes kind of a natural part of the rhythm of your day, for me, it's easier. So, but I try to get in pretty much every day. Every day, I'm doing something. Yeah, sometimes less on certain days. Yeah.
Could you tell us about your new book that's coming out this fall?
Yeah, my grandmother's farm, some of you surely know the Aho community between Blowing Rock and Boone. Oh, you do? Okay, well, you know it well. Okay, well, if you know where that little church is, that land right below that White House is where my mom was born. Grew up, that farm. And I've always, that place was very important to me growing up. I spent a lot of time there. So I wanted to write it. I wanted to kind of make it continue. I wanted to at least let it be in my imagination. So the book is set there. And it's set, it's based on something that actually happened during World War II. A man married a woman. He was from a pretty upper, or at least in a small town, very higher class than she was. And the parents really didn't want him to marry her, and he eloped with her. But he got drafted into World War II. And while he was gone, they told her that she had died in childbirth. And it turned out that wasn't how she died. And so that story is kind of I thought about that story. I heard that story about 25 years ago, and it was actually one that just kind of stayed with me that I knew I'd eventually write or try to write. But I said it in 1950. And it's about I have him go to Korea, and he comes back. But it also deals with actually, if you know that church, the caretaker of the church is this man who had polio, and he kind of takes her in and protects her. So yeah, it's the hardest novel I've ever done, and I think where I made my big mistake was, the story was so good in nonfiction that it kind of hindered me, because I felt like I kind of, and once I realized I got to break out of that, it kind of came for me. Yeah.
Is it dark?
Well, it starts in a graveyard. No, actually, honestly, I can say it has a happy ending. Yeah, nobody believes that, do you? But
At this moment in time, what would you say is your most proud piece of work that you have? Why?
Gosh, oh man, that's tough. I think the collection Burning Bright, short story collection. Actually, that little story I read is part of that. That's the short story collection I'm proudest of, and. The novels, I mean, One Foot in Eden and Serena. I felt like those are the two. They both did something different. One Foot in Eden was important to me because I wanted to save the regional vernacular, or not save it, but I wanted to do what I could to kind of preserve it. So that was a book I felt good. And I wanted to show and particularly in One Foot in Eden, I've tried to do this in all my books. I wanted, one thing that people, they have this kind of stereotypical view of Appalachian language as being, a little more than grunts and a few syllables. And I don't buy that. And what I find interesting about folk language is not just Appalachian, but almost any folk language is the richness and the sophistication. And the way you know the sophistication is because of the use of similes. To create a simile, you have to be intelligent, because you're taking two unalike things and you're drawing this. And Appalachian speech that I grew up hearing is incredibly rich that way. And I've used this example a lot, but when I was 16 or 17, I was with my uncle in Boone, and he saw, it was summertime, and I was with him, and this Appalachian, the young, probably, I'm sure, an Appalachian college student came by. I was 16 years old, and she was scantily clad by my uncle's standards. And he saw me looking at her, and he said, that girl hasn't got enough clothes on to wad a shotgun. And if you think about that, that's pretty damn brilliant. I mean, really. I mean, think about what you're, Fred Chappell, he has in his book, I Am One of You Forever, the mother says that he and his her son-in-law and his best friend have brains the size of June peas. And, I mean, just that kind of, fun with the language. So, yeah. Well, we're going to do one more, and I think we'll have had a good evening. One more question.
What's the movie that was written through?
One was Serena.
Serena?
Yeah, they made a movie of that, which, where else to film a movie about Appalachia than the Czech Republic? And if you watch that movie, one thing that I find highly amusing in the middle of that movie, which is set in the Smoky Mountains, the book is set in is you'll see a European brown bear, the first one ever spotted in Smoky Mountains. The other one.
Did they follow your script pretty good?
Hell no. Are you kidding? No, and I knew better because I had a friend, Pat Conroy was a good friend of mine, and he'd had like 5 or 6 movies. He said, don't even try. They're not going to listen. But there's another movie, and it's a much lower budget, but it's a really good movie of my third novel, The World Made Straight. And they filmed it in Madison and Buncombe County. The World Made Straight. Yeah, so, but I just kind of, I just kind of stay out of that. I mean, I don't know. They don't want me around. I've got better things to do, and, I'm a writer, so I pretty much stay away from it. Well, thank y'all. It's been good evening.